All right. So that's live. Simon, welcome to the Vertical SaaS Podcast, man. Great to finally be having you on and doing this.
Thanks ever so much, Gav. Yeah, it's been a little bit of a journey, hasn't it? We've had some technical issues over the last few weeks, but we're here now.
Yeah, yeah. Just echoing the upgrades to my infrastructure as we go into year two of the podcast. We went from a Windows to a MacBook, and yeah, quite a difference. But no, it's great to get it in. I know you've been super busy, as have I. Really excited to discuss all things CLM, AI, Agentic AI, legal tech, and the rest.
Sounds good. Likewise. Yeah, happy to get stuck in.
Yeah, so for those that will know you listening to this, but there'll be, of course, just as much that maybe don't, do you want to, could you kindly introduce yourself, please? Just your role, what you do, who you work for, that kind of thing. Very light intro. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. So I suppose I've been exclusively in the CLM space now for the last 15 years. That journey really started as a complete accident. I was working for an insurance broker and we were deploying all manner of different IT solutions before one day my boss came over and said, we're going to be launching this contracting platform and we want you to lead that project. So from my perspective, it was going from absolutely zero base knowledge to being in the thick of it in no time at all. And then that journey evolved from there. I think that, I don't know what happened really. Something just grabbed me. I thought that this, at the time, 15 years ago, I thought this was hugely innovative and very different. And I've just made a career out of it. So I've worked for a number of CLM vendors. I was a director at KPMG's Contract Lifecycle Management team in the UK. And as of right now, I am the VP of Enterprise Transformation at ContractPod. So essentially working with the vendor to ultimately scale us and grow us through our enterprise accounts. So yeah, that's me really. A bit of everything: pre-sales, product, implementation, marketing. You name it, I'm there. But yeah, never a dull day for sure.
And probably being a bit modest on the implementations, you may have the most implementations under your belt as a singular human being. You might have more implementations than some companies.
Yeah, I mean it's quite interesting. So in my former team, they actually made me a T-shirt, which at
CLM King.
well, it said I've done over 150 CLM implementations. So it's a lot. But when you break it down, it's probably about 10 big projects per year if you think about the sort of 15 years that I've been doing it. But I think it does help. I've seen the good, the bad, the ugly, and I try to bring all of that knowledge to clients to really help shape what a successful transformation looks like.
Mm. So yes, we've got over 150 implementations. As I say, I'll quote you as a CLM king. So really,
I'll take that.
before we get into two camps, so we're speaking off camera, people that feel there's still the rise and there's still a lot of life left to be had in the CLM world, and there's those that think it's the death of CLM and the rise of Agentic AI. But before we get into all that, appreciate you just ran us through your journey a little bit. But you kind of said you fell into it, which I think in the worlds of legal and insurance, you kind of hear that a lot. But what first got you into this space? Like when you say you fell into the contracts by accident, or do you think when you fell into it by accident, you just became a bit of a self-declared, CLM geek from day one?
I think there was definitely a bit of that. One of the things I've always said is I love interviewing candidates coming into roles in this sector because
Mm,
I don't think any of us went to university or college and said, I'm going to be in CLM or I'm going to be in legal tech, right?
yeah,
Most of
of
us have
course.
found our way into this through other means, and I find it absolutely fascinating as a result, hearing what people's backgrounds are. How did you
Mm,
get where you got to? So yeah, I mean, the truth be told, at the time I was deploying insurance broking platforms, and
mm,
I say this because I've got friends and family in that sector, and I've got many colleagues that I've worked with. But you know,
yeah.
for me, that just wasn't particularly exciting. And the program of work that I was responsible for was very much a sort of force upon the business.
Mm,
So this is the new platform, take it or leave it. And so I'd been doing that for about 18 months. And as I say, when this opportunity came along, basically my boss said, we've got the vendor coming in and they're going to be doing a show and tell of some of the capabilities that we're going to be leveraging. Now, if we wind back 15 years ago, there wasn't really that much pure CLM. There were some legacy platforms, the sort of MTauruses and of this world and things like that. But most of it was still sort of early days DocGen. A lot of it was document assembly, a little bit of workflow. And I remember the platform was Exari, who I ended up having a sort of 8-year career with afterwards. But I remember vividly the day that a gentleman, Jeff Maskell, walked into the room, who ultimately ended up becoming my sort of boss and mentor for many years. But he walked into the room and he did this pitch and demo of this tech. And I think a big part of it was the element of, God, this looks so much more interesting than what I've been doing. That was definitely a pull for me. But the other part of it was just like I could see immediately that this was not your average transformation program. I could see immediately that this was a massive shift in terms of going from what was largely a completely digital-less process to something that was really quite extreme in some ways in its difference. And I had the privilege of working on that project and deploying the technology into the business, and it was a large scale transformation program. For me, the biggest observation I had was how difficult it was to get the business to buy into that degree of digital transformation and change. It was a huge leap, and for many, still to this day, far too big a leap in some ways. So. I got burnt like a lot of people do with the classics of change management and adoption early in that project. What I often tell clients and prospects alike is, I genuinely have been there. I've felt your pain. I've seen how hard it is to deploy this within my own business unit. So I try and bring that empathy to the journey and sort of hope that some of that sort of, rubs off on the client in the way that they then get success out of it.
So that was your first contract tech product that you worked on,
and it wasn't a raving success. It was very, very, very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, back then, and I mean, as you see, even now, it's something which we'll talk about why people still struggle so much to get it right. What's the favourite hat that you like to wear, followed up by, because your job, we've spoken about this as a recruiter, I'm always really just interested in what your day-to-day is, because it's so broad and you touch so much of the business. But like, what's your favourite hat, and how would you explain your job to someone at a dinner party in under 10 words?
Wow. I mean, that's hard. I often say, like, I'm an IT consultant.
Yeah,
and I just sort of try and keep it really simple. But yeah, I mean, it was really interesting because I started with a sort of implementation role.
Yeah.
As you can imagine, I moved over to the vendor side, so I joined Exari after that project. Now, when you start to become proficient in the technology, you then start to be drawn a lot more into a sales process, right? So people are drawing you in all the time because you then become sort of quote unquote the expert in the technology. So I quickly sort of transitioned from implementation into pre-sales, did a lot of work in terms of that. And then I guess once you've been on the receiving end of a lot of customer feedback about how to make your product more effective, you've been on receiving end from prospective clients in the sales process about how to make your product more effective, you become a real thorn in the product team's side, right? Because you're forever knocking on the product team's door saying, here's some ways that I think, we can make the product better. Yeah. And eventually, for me, the conversation quickly pivoted to, do you know what? You take over product. So sort of, I eventually went from sort of implementation, pre-sales into product management. And right. And then sort of, the acquisition of Exari by Cooper happened in 2019, stayed on in a product role throughout my tenure at Cooper, and obviously sort of much more of a sort of buy-side procurement, P2P focus in the CLM there. But, where do I really get the most kicks? I really like the cross-functional nature of the work that I do today. My role today allows me to engage with prospective clients. It allows me to work directly with them post-sale, sort of that executive sponsor type role. I continue to act as a conduit into our product and marketing teams. And I also work very closely with our partners as well, because for obvious reasons, having worked in the Big Four, I can talk the talk with our partners. So it's very difficult to sort of say, where's the one piece? I do still think getting a real sense of satisfaction from seeing a successful transformation. And that is not always easy, right? And it would be totally inappropriate for me to suggest that every single one of them is successful, because they are not. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. But I do still love that. I love seeing the success at the end of a journey.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. That change management piece is the piece that in our world in legal tech is what, again, has been a big part of discussions over the last few weeks and months at various legal tech focused events. And it's almost like that AI managed service now, if that makes sense. It's kind of like, obviously the big four, your managed service, they do all these big ERP, CLM implementations, but now kind of feels like we're moving that direction where we need more people like you take companies through, that next phase. Okay, we can implement it, we can adopt it, but what do we do with it? Where do we get the real value from it? And I think that's the next big piece of it. And again, there's probably some people out there that say the big four's dead, consultants are dead, or whatever, but I just think it's the next evolution of their job.
Absolutely. I don't think any of us as consultants are going away. I see myself as a quote unquote experienced person in the CLM space. I think, could ultimately AI replace all of the wares and skills that I have? No, but I can work with AI, and AI can work with me to ultimately ensure that we're delivering the most appropriate value to customers and accelerating time to value. So
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one. I think the change management component is more critical now than ever. I mean, a lot of people have been talking for many years about how important change management is, particularly with the prevalence of sort of failed CLM implementations. I mean, let's just keep it really simple. Without change management, any digital transformation program is going to fail, CLM or otherwise. But I think now we're in a world where we really have to make sure that you're going to have a large cohort of people who are going to be adopting cutting edge technologies. And in some ways, particularly with the legal persona, you can argue that you're sort of pitting them directly against an AI. Now, we can all talk about the fact that this is designed to be an enabler and it's designed to be an assistant, and ultimately, human in the loop, making sure that the decisions that are made are the correct ones. But ultimately, there will be many organizations and many individuals within organizations who still fear that this is designed to take away their jobs. And, you only have to have one of those detractors with a big enough voice in a very small scale transformation project for it to go downhill rapidly as a result. So managing the change, I think, is arguably more critical now than ever before.
Ultimately, though, it's jobs will be lost to it. There's no doubt. But again, I think probably through every wave of uncertainty, a lot of discussion like this happens, but jobs will certainly be lost. Like, you see all these guys, what was it, the CEO of Palantir last week was saying, like, we're not designing it to take people's jobs, but we're designing something that at some point in the next 2 years, AGI will come out. We won't really have as much control over it as we once thought that we had. So we're not designing it right now to take people's jobs, but ultimately in time, it's absolutely going to take people's jobs. And I think that element of your nicheness and your expertise, something that people want to deal with and have to deal with, that is going to be so tangible. And I think a lot of other stuff is going to fall through the net in terms of roles, capability, levels that people start at. I don't know. I think the next 2 or 3 years, particularly in our world in software, there is going to be a huge shake-up. But that change management piece, like you say, is so important to get people to understand how to get up to speed and get ahead of it, and really try and think deeply and inherently about what their core skills really are and how they can add value to any organization over and above AI.
Definitely, and also thinking as well about, there's been a lot of quotes about, AI won't replace the lawyer, but the lawyer using AI will replace the lawyer that is not, right?
Doesn't,
those types of things, unquestionably so. Right, but I think we're at this sort of tipping point now where it's going to be a hugely exciting period to be honest, in our overall evolution as human beings, to see where does this go, how does this influence our day to day, what do we do? My kids are in school, and I'm sitting there thinking, what kind of jobs will they have?
Yeah, I was
What are
thinking about that the other day myself.
Right,
With my
what are the
daughter,
skills? What are the skills that they should be considering? And they're relatively young, but at what point should they be interacting with this technology and really familiarizing themselves? Because let's be frank, it's going to be embedded in every facet of our day-to-day lives, if not already is. So,
Probably embedded into every facet of our lives, but in schools it will be banned. And that's the problem. Like, it's just wild that is probably going to be the case. So we need to step in, and we can't allow that to happen, because I don't want my kids growing up thinking ChatGPT is a bad thing. It's not. It's the best thing that's since sliced bread. But anyway, we're going off course a little bit. So CLM, really obvious question. Just what is it? Let's dumb it down. What is CLM? Why is CLM so hard to get right? And why does it carry so much stigma?
Right. Okay. I mean, CLM at the end of the day, there might be people that don't realize it. CLM, Contract Lifecycle Management. Okay. That is the processes and operating models within a business that define the way in which contract management is done. How do I take contracts from somebody thinking there's a need for a contract all the way through to getting that contract executed, but then more importantly, forever managed after its signature? And the most interesting thing about this is it raises a question which you could say it's a philosophical question, but it's a question that's never really been definitively answered, which is, who owns contracting?
Yeah. Who should own the CLM? Yeah.
Right. And there's a clear distinction as well between contract lifecycle management as an operating model and contract lifecycle management systems, which are technology platforms designed to automate or augment aspects of your contracting operation. Now, the interesting thing about contracting is it is not like, if we think about CRM is primarily, it's not exclusively, but it's primarily for the sales org, revenue generating teams. A procurement platform, a P2P, is primarily for procurement teams. The biggest stigma, or I would say stigma, the biggest misconception about contract lifecycle management is it is for legal. Right? And I have a somewhat controversial view. I don't believe for a second that CLM is actually legal tech.
So what happens when it's seen that way, though, for legal?
So I have the biggest sympathy for legal teams, because not a day will go by where they are not told, you need to go and procure tech. You need to augment our tech stack. You need legal tech to help you. The marketing will tell them CLM is for them. The vendors will say CLM is for them. The analysts will say CLM is for them. And legal operations will feel that they must be, of course they are, everyone's telling them they are the custodians of CLM. Right. But CLM is a cross-functional, enterprise-wide transformation initiative, because not one team owns contracting within any business. No. Legal is responsible for the guardrails and the risk profile, the legalese of any given contract. But once that contract is executed, it's the responsibility of the business to ultimately ensure that they remain in compliance with it. And the biggest misconception about CLM is it's primarily a pre-signature tool, sort of drafting, negotiation, the legal bits, and that legal have to own that. And I think, if I'm honest, it's often not really said. There's lots of things said about why do CLM implementations fail. A lot of it is a lack of readiness. It's about misunderstanding the sort of effort involved in it. It's trying to do too much too quickly. It's the change management piece. But actually, for me, certainly in those sort of 15 years of what I've seen, where is it most likely to fail? It's when it's not a cross-functional initiative. If it's only driven by any one function of the business, the chances are it's not going to realize the benefit. it might not even get live. And that, I think, is ultimately, you know, when we see that maybe 50% plus CLMs fail to deliver the value, that's a big concern for a lot of businesses.
Mm. So what's the real cost of a badly managed or poorly implemented CLM for an organization, and how does one get there? You
Yeah.
know, to a poor one.
Right. I mean, the things that I've seen over the years, I've seen a real mixture. I've seen a lot of IT teams run these transformation projects, which I have no objection to that. IT teams tend to drive large scale transformation programs, but they drive it without the engagement of the SMEs. So legal and the business aren't actually core representatives of the project. It's just an IT led project. That stands one of the biggest chances of failure because ultimately the decisions are being made without the subject matter
The
experts
wrong
being
people,
consulted.
yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Equally, I've seen many legal-led projects where decisions are being made on behalf of the business and the business are not representative to the core project. And more often than not, of course, what happens is you get to a point where you start to roll these platforms out. And in some cases, the first time the business even have a say in how this platform is going to work is when they're in training to use it. You know, and this isn't going to work for me. Why wasn't I consulted? You know, that kind of classic thing. The cost as a base minimum is whatever you've paid for a 3-year license term on the software, right? Because you're not going to renew it. You're not going to get anywhere beyond that. Plus whatever you've spent on an SI to implement it. So you could be spending millions on a failed implementation potentially
Millions. Yeah.
before you've even started.
So, I mean, it'd probably be so hard to give an average cost of a CLM because size of the org, etc. But I mean, the cost of these types of implementations is super high, like ERPs, CRMs, etc. It's a full-on, as you say, end-to-end ubiquitous transformation in the business. So, this little thing, AI, comes along in the last 18, 24 months. Just this little chat GPT thing pops up on our desktops, and we're all like, oh, what's this? 2 years later, the conversation at that Legal Tech Talk last week about Agentic AI and AI previous to the year before, and how this whole CLM is dead. Like, I guess my question is more around what is your thoughts on the coexistence of a CLM and an AI or point solution, LLM point solution, because as I say, a lot of the conversation for me was really around one source of truth, and the CLM not being that source of truth for the long term, because why would it be when we've got this agentic AI that can take all of that data and structure it in a way that a CLM has never managed to do, and probably do it at the cost of like $1 million cheaper.
And I don't dispute, you know, that. I think the interesting thing here is, you know, you mentioned the whole CLM is dead thing. Sort of brings full circle to what I said earlier, which is CLM is the operating models and processes that govern contracting.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever I hear this sort of the idea that CLM is dead, you know, in the cold light of day, what you're saying then is that contracting is no more, because CLM, remember, is not the tech. It's the operating model and processes that govern contracting. So let's be clear, that's not dead, that's not going away. Contracting will continue. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So really what we're saying is that the way in which we do it and the technology enablers that are available to us are going to dramatically evolve. And I think this has been you know, more broadly, the whole vertical SaaS topic in general, these technology solutions have been evolving for a long time. You know, if we wind back 15, 20 years and look at what CLM tech was like, you know, it was pretty archaic, right? You know, and
Yeah.
at best it was a clunky repository. You know, it evolved into document assembly tools. You know, I was part of the sort of the first acquisition and launch of pre-gen AI, you know, sort of large language models, natural language processing and machine learning, back in Exari in sort of 2017, 2018. hugely exciting times. I think the key thing now, and this is why it's sort of more exciting than ever, is the tech is sort of finally able to deliver on the promise. Because if we think back, what were we selling 3 or 4 years ago, pre-Agentic AI, pre-LLMs? Same thing, right? Data extraction,
Centralization.
centralization, clause, analytics, all this stuff. So what's fundamentally different in the sales messaging? Not a great deal, other than the fact that it's now generative AI and agentic, which brackets really translates as now it actually works, right? That's really, if we think about the evolution of CLM specifically, that's what we're saying. I think this is a really, really exciting time for both vendors and customers alike. I think that the point solution piece, on one hand, you could say the market is absolutely flooded. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of point solution providers out there. I want to be really, really clear. CLM is often a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You don't necessarily need it. Again, there's a lot of pressure, particularly on legal operations and legal teams. You should have a CLM. Not necessarily. It really comes back to what are the pain points that you're trying to solve for, and does actually a point solution more than accommodate those? And with the whole agentic component, you're now looking in a world, to your point, where, well, the system of record, does it have to be a CLM? If we, think about how many conversations I have with prospective customers, where are your documents stored today? It could be in any manner of multiple repositories, right? It could be in existing CLMs. More often or not, though, 75% plus of the time, it's in SharePoint. Right. So, the idea of having to have a conversation about taking all of that and moving it to another system of record and going through a hefty and painful contract migration process, even with generative AI, is that really necessary? We have to ask ourselves, are these necessary? And this is why I think it presents a real opportunity, because vendors who can pivot to a more modular approach, or even those vendors who have sort of end-to-end CLM, but can carve it up in such a way that they can say, right, the only piece that you really need is this. And that requires real deep expertise and collaboration in a sales process, right? That is not coming in and just throwing 10 products at a prospective customer. That's really understanding, where can I add the most value? Because for me, AI has to create a call to action. There's so many point solutions out there that are just doing fancy stuff. It looks great in a demo, but actually it's either creating the same amount of time for the user, or it's actually adding time to their process, right? Whereas if I can create a call to action, if this AI gives me an output, if this defines the next step in my journey, if this gives me some valuable insight, then all of a sudden, maybe I don't need a full end-to-end CLM. And I think what's really going to happen then is the point solution players will have their success with the targeted areas that they need to focus on. And then the platform players, if they break their platforms up into a more modular approach, get the benefits of clients who want the full end-to-end or need many aspects of the end-to-end, whilst also being able to offer, bits and pieces where required.
So the incumbents, or the longer generational players, have got a massive opportunity here with it. But we're potentially, for the point solutions, I totally agree. I think right now that the stuff that we're seeing, raising all sorts of money, crazy valuations, or guys sitting from their basement vibe coding a tool and selling it for $40 a month, it's great, but like defensibility at scale, 1 point to what, it's probably not. It can't be that complex solution to address a whole hugely unsophisticated, complex market. But so we're either heading towards an AI Lego stack, or we're building, I guess, more, to Richard Maybe's point from Duro, like Frankenstack products again. We're doing the whole CLM ERP thing, but we're just going to do it now with shitloads of AI products. And then it's just going to be
possibly
all these AI, because I'm a bit guilty of it. I've got shiny object syndrome. I see the new the latest, if it's Lovable or all these apps that have come out one after one. You play with them, all the operating models, GPT, Claude, etc. And then also the recruitment specific software, the recruitment AI things now, and it's just so much vaporware out there right now. It is hard to see where the real value is, and as replacing 5 old school legacy cloud based whatever tools, low code tools with 5 AI tools. I don't know. It would just create more work and more tools.
Quite possibly. I mean, you mentioned defensibility. That we can't underestimate how many products on the market are basically just wrappers around, open source LLMs, and there's no proprietary data there. You're essentially renting somebody else's intelligence, but repackaging it as your own product, right? So
Yeah.
the sort of defensibility there is zero, and the risk is also, your dependence on those underlying LLMs. If something fundamentally changes in the way that they operate or the way that they output or whatever it is that you might be using it for, you could become obsolete overnight. All right. So I think to me, there's still this idea of the durable platform. I still believe strongly that even if you are offering point solutions, the right way to do it is to still orchestrate through some kind of workflow process. I still think at the end of the day, it still needs a great data model. It still needs workflow processes, right? And there's a lot that don't, right? I hear a lot all the time about, you don't need those things anymore. You're misunderstanding what it means in the world of generative AI. You can't go into a Fortune 500 unable to articulate your data schema, for example. You need to have you need to have a very clear line of sight as to what it is that your platform is so well attuned to do, and what value it's going to bring, and what data and insights it's going to bring. And if you can't answer those questions, that's not a scalable solution.
No, I totally agree. I think the data moat now is more critical than ever. I think there's a few moats at the moment, and I'm talking legal specifically, but I think it probably applies to a lot of other similar reg tech type industries. The first one is that the data moat. Have we got the data? Can we manipulate it in a way like no other? What are our models doing with it? I think number 2, and this is very thing will be legal, I think user experience ranks just almost top for me, because everyone's building kind of the same stuff now. Like some companies will be referred to as a CLM company, and they're not. So everyone's getting bundled at the same thing. So it's like we're all kind of offering the same type of service. So whose just feels seamless? And then I think the third part is maybe designing a product or a piece of tech that allows organizations to change the design of their org, how it looks. So who wins in this space? Who dies? And what do you think? What does the next CLM even look like for you over the next 24 to 36 months?
I think it comes down to your point. I think it comes down to integration and habit. There are a number of providers on the market with significant valuations, right? And people are questioning, well, what is it that they bring? Why are they better than any of these other tools that look remarkably similar or do very similar things? Tends to be the workflow orchestration component. It tends to be the integration component. And as a direct result of that, and you mentioned this as well, it's habit. I want to use it. I enjoy using it. Suddenly that becomes one of the most prevalent drivers in terms of what does or doesn't make this a success. I think the other thing as well is making sure that the tech is balanced in terms of the way that you build and deploy the human in the loop interface. If you can provide a great data extraction tool and it looks great in a demo, but it offers the user no intervention, no QC, no ability to adjust the data, no feedback loop, then you're either extremely confident that it's forever 100% accurate and no one ever needs it, or you've just created a shiny toy that actually no one's ever going to use in practice because it's too clunky. So really thinking about the combination of the sort of the integration and habit and the human in the loop component. The other thing as well is proprietary data. Right? The more data that you have access to, that's the ultimate moat, right? Because if you've got access to tens of millions of legal documents per se, let's keep stick in this domain, then your ability to provide guidance and recommendations and extract data and negotiate and redline contracts, all those things will become so much more prolific and so much better than others that don't have access to those capabilities. So I think it's thinking about those things. The other thing as well, which I won't labor the point because I think most vendors are doing this now anyway, but 12 months ago, most vendors were sort of wedded to an LLM. I think most are understanding now that different LLMs, serve different purposes or have different pros and cons. Some do deeper levels of analysis better than others, making sure that whatever your solution looks like, it's scalable and can leverage different, technology as and when required.
Mm. What do you think? Where do you draw the line, or how do you define? You touched on that a few moments ago around a tool and a platform. Like, where do you draw the line today?
I think it's a great question. I mean, I work with many customers who are really just looking for a tool to augment or fix a specific problem. What's quite interesting, with some of the interactions I have today, many customers have already got some kind of end-to-end CLM platform, right? Maybe it's not that CLM is dead, that it's just that they're dead bored of more CLMs, right? They don't want to go and change up their CLM, but they might be frustrated about the fact that it has certain deficiencies or maybe isn't leading the charge. We talked earlier about the fact that vendors have a real opportunity here to not reinvent themselves, but make sure that they're fundamentally embedding best of breed latest technologies into their platforms as quickly as possible. There'll be many vendors that aren't doing that. There'll be legacy tech stacks that don't lend themselves to rapid innovation. As a result, customers will be saying, I've seen your generative AI roadmap, but according to this, I'm not going to get contract redlining for another 12 months, whereas I could go to market today and find 50 solutions that all do contract redlining. The key then is how many of those 50 solutions can seamlessly integrate, my point around integration, into your existing workflow and orchestration tools. So then I can just buy that one piece and plug it in and say, right, it's not, there is that idea, of the whole sort of patchwork could be a real mess. And we need to be wary of that. But at the same time, it could also be, I've got one or two point solutions to augment something else that's already doing most of the work. So having that flexibility, I think as a vendor and as a buyer is actually really exciting.
And the kind of off the back of what you're saying there, the way that I would see that working so well and effectively is by creating the ultimate agent orchestration to do that. Because once you get that ultimate agent legal to integrate with all these disparate, kludgy, not systems that aren't connecting with each other, and this thing can just go through it and bring all that together. That's, for me, that's the way I see it. But I mean,
I agree. I mean, I think as well, again, there's so many point solutions on the market that are targeting the legal persona, right? Most of them are around these kind of contract review, redlining, these types of things, and these are all great. Okay, I'm certainly not disputing that. But again, if we think about where's the biggest business value, I still believe firmly it's in the non-legal use cases, right? It tends to be focused in the post-signature. If you think about post-signature obligation management, making sure that we're managing effectively SLAs, KPIs, performance metrics. Mm-hmm. You could start with something really simple. What's the simplest use case there? It's making sure that I don't miss a renewal that I was looking to cancel, or something really, really simple like that.
Yeah.
But contracting is, it becomes a very competitive process, right? I know this as a vendor ourselves, right? There are certain obligations and commitments that we need to make to win a piece of business, right? Really critical then that we understand what those commitments are. And if one of them says that Simon has to send the customer a report every 4 weeks, being able to surface that information and for me to proactively demonstrate from an audit and compliance perspective that I did it, so that we didn't pay a $50,000 penalty on that one provision, that's, to me, much more valuable. Because I think one of the biggest challenges, again, talks sort of full circle to that whole piece around CLM adoption and success, and did it really achieve what it set out to achieve? A lot of the legal use cases are based around things like operational efficiencies, right? I can do things faster.
Yeah,
or I can do
that's all.
things with less bodies.
All it
Right?
is now. That's all
Right.
the chat now.
Right. Whereas to me, where's the biggest value? It's in the fact that, without these tools to assist me, I'm potentially hemorrhaging anywhere between 5 and 10% of revenue per annum. I worked with a customer recently who built their entire business case around post-signature obligation management, and I encourage many more to do the same. It's not a legal use case, right? It's for the enterprise, it's for the business.
Yes.
Because they said, okay, conservatively, if we build our business case around, let's assume that we're actually only hemorrhaging 1% of revenue, even though most analysts are going to tell us it's 5 to 10%. And I used to be part of a team at KPMG. We had a contracts audits team, so we'd send them in to actually audit against the transactional systems, and you'd often find 5% minimum in leakage.
Wow.
So, the business case for CLM was predicated around the idea of, well, let's just assume it's 1%, but 1% for this particular business was 20 million euros a year. So, whereas if you build your business case around, I think I'm going to be more efficient, and I certainly don't track and measure any or have any data today to tell me how efficient I am or not. That's typically when it gets to CFO for board approval. That's typically when someone looks at you and says, I'm not so sure about this, right? So
Yeah.
I always think the enterprise-wide transformative impact of these technologies is where you get your business value. It's where you get your business case signed off. It's where you can deliver some really quick wins. And I think focusing on that first and then delivering some of the more efficient sort of pre-signature, I wouldn't call them tactical. They're still really important, but I don't see them as strategic as the sort of the post-signature piece.
I think that's probably a really good representation of where the market is today, though. When you see all the companies getting the funding, when you see all the companies really going to the moon, you get a few that are focused on the actual really, really hard focused legal work. It's only a handful for me, and we all know who they are. But I'd say the vast majority up and coming in the past 12 months that have raised 40, 50, 20 million are all looking at that side of the legal chain. Post-signature, how is this affecting the whole organisation from an enterprise perspective? And this isn't legal tech, this is tech that helps the legal process for many, many teams and many, many people in the business. So, yeah, interesting. I guess off the back of that, a good question to ask for me, to CLM or not to CLM. So today, when a business or a founder, say of a Series B company or Series A, and he's looking to, things are getting a bit crazy, and this is the first time they're going to adopt this type of solution, and now they've got this Agentic AI, all this shiny stuff, and they've got the CLM providers. So to CLM or not to CLM, if you were a CFO or a CEO of a company looking to adopt, so what would you need to believe to sign this off? What do you think people should be seeing now or making their decisions based on?
I think it continues to come back to what are the pain points that are inherent within your business, and it never ceases to amaze me. I see so many RFPs and so many evaluation processes where I don't actually see any pain points articulated. I see feature lists. Whenever I see customers tend to evaluate, it tends to be, here's a laundry list of feature capability. But what we really need to do is go right back to what's the problem you're trying to solve, and how big a pain point is that for your business? Because that in of itself should immediately drive you to a certain outcome. I think the other thing as well is, all of this technology is incredible. Sometimes organizations, based on their overall maturity level, they don't need the Tesla, right? They might need a clapped out old Mini, right?
Yeah.
Because their overall maturity level demands that they just need a repository and they've never had one before. So it's a combination of where's your overall maturity and what is the pain that you're trying to solve, and prioritize those pain points and really think about that cross-functionally. Because if you ask the legal team for their input and then you ask the business teams, procurement, sales, IT, finance, you'll get very different conflicting priorities. That's normal and that's healthy. And then it's about working out as a business, where should we be investing the time? All of that work is I appreciate it's not the most exciting work, but it's
Yeah.
absolutely critical in terms of setting you up in terms of your path as to, do I need a hefty end-to-end CLM platform, or actually am I just looking to address some other problems elsewhere in my business?
Some workflow issues, a few efficiency gains, that kind of thing. So
Exactly.
what's the cost of doing nothing? So many companies, as you say, limping along with Word, SharePoint, email. What's the cost of that in terms of risk, missed revenue, or headcount drag?
I think this is a really interesting question. I think if you'd asked that question maybe 15 years ago, and look
Death.
at but look at where we are now. Many of those organizations and many of those individuals will still be doing things the way they did 15 years ago.
Yeah.
There are many. I work for a cutting edge Gen AI focused CLM provider. There are many of our customers who are just looking to go to a repository, right? They are looking to take that jump into the clapped out mini, right? And so it's quite an interesting one, because I think what's different this time round is the sheer scale of influence that these new AI tools have on every facet of our day to day.
Yeah.
I could afford, as a legal professional 15 years ago, to continue doing things the way that I was. I don't have that luxury anymore. The key thing here is, and we sort of talked about this earlier, if I don't adopt, if I don't transform, if I don't adapt, the way that I did things before, that's never coming back. And so I think that's what's, I see it as a really exciting time, right? It's a real opportunity for everybody to fully embrace that transformation. I'm equally aware of how big a transformation that can be for some teams and individuals. So I think that's where it's going to be most interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear someone that's been spent 20 years in CLM, and there's a lot of talk about CLM being dead, and you're excited. And that's the difference in mindset.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's guys with 20 years in CLM that are sitting here pulling their hair out going, fuck.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element like with, who I think we have to ask ourselves, who is saying CLM is dead? A lot of it's coming from the point solution players, right?
Exactly. I was just about to say it's coming from the guys that are building agents.
Right.
Really.
And I think the key thing there is, why can't a CLM provider build agents?
This leads me on to my final question, actually, which I think has perfectly teed me up. To that point, if you were building, and this will happen, I think someone is going to come along and build the new CRM, the new ERP, the new and the new CLM. But that is going to be something that's wildly better than every CLM that's previously existed. And we're still going to call it a CLM, but it's going to be completely built on top of a model. It won't be half baked in there, So if you were building a CLM from scratch today, with everything you've learned, everything you know up to this point about AI, what would be the main things you would do differently?
I think it would still come down to data model and object model. I continue to see, across the industry, I'll start by saying no CLM is perfect by any means, right? But I think a lot of CLMs have been built for specific use cases. Either they've been built for a commercial persona, those that integrate heavily into Salesforce, there's those that have been built sort of purely from a sort of vendor side. There are those that have been built for the legal persona. All of them face scalability challenges. Why? Because they were never designed holistically to support end-to-end enterprise contracting. One of the things that we actually launched at Exari way back when was this idea of a universal contract model. And the idea that we want to make sure that we're designing a platform that has all of the building blocks necessary to scale into every use case, because it's great if your CLM can demo a simple NDA workflow, right? But contracting in most enterprises is not that simple. It's far from simple. It's extremely complex. So I think taking all the lessons learned and actually making sure that just the base data and object model is there to scale for every possible scenario. That's nothing to do with generative AI. That's just making sure that you've got a foundation to build upon. Then you start layering in all of the orchestration tools,
Yeah.
Agentic AI, and you're flying, because now you're in a world where you've got, end-to-end sort of workflow orchestration, right? From AI-powered contracting, drafting, review, automated negotiation agents,
Yeah.
these things are already there, right? They might be at the sort of the cutting edge, but they're already there. But building all of that into the end-to-end workflow, thinking about how you then integrate it downstream into things like blockchain. How do you predictive analytics, contracting performance, the obligation management piece, agents that can ultimately trawl through any of the other tech stack systems to ultimately discover, are we in line with payment terms? Have we done all of the things that we said we would do from an obligations perspective? Because obligation management, I know I bang on about this a lot, but it's not just about extracting the commitments that are in the contract. It's about truly tracking and managing and committing to the fact that we or our customer and or supplier are meeting those commitments. And that's where, again, agents play such a key role, right? Because most CLMs today rely on sending alerts and reminders to make sure that you track your obligations.
Yeah.
But in the world of agentic AI, you're in a position where agents can be doing all of that all day long for you, checking every other system of record, making sure all those things are happening. And that is hugely valuable to a business.
The CLM could notify the agent can do the task, and the agent can update you when it's done.
Right, because
you don't even know what's going on until it's done.
Exactly. I always talk a lot about the difference between obligation tracking, which is, hello, Simon, you've got a commitment that you need to make. Oh, yeah, here's the evidence, mark it as done. It's kind of a workflow tool and a notification tool. It's very effective, but, it's quite fashioned in a way, versus fully autonomous agentic review. All I have to do is go and check to make sure that I'm comfortable with the outputs or comfortable with the information that's being trawled from these other systems. I mean, it's hugely exciting. And as I say, it touches every facet of the end-to-end life cycle. So, yeah, I mean, does there need to be end-to-end CLM for everybody? No. Do I still think that there are going to be platform players that excel at providing and reinventing this idea of end-to-end CLM? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. You probably highlighted in your answer a few seconds ago about 3 or 4 new startup ideas in the legal tech space without even realising it. So if anyone listens to this, I don't know. I'm going to steal one of them, I think. But Simon, honestly, really, really happy that we managed to finally get this one in. This has been a great episode on all things CLM. So really appreciate your time for coming on.
My pleasure, Gavin. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.